Okay, it is 2 o'clock, so let's start. Okay, so again, welcome back. Um, it's really nice to see some of your faces, though not so many. I wish you'd turn on your cameras if you could. Um, we are in a new year and looking at, I think, a new book together. I think the last time we studied together, if I'm not mistaken, we were not yet in Shemot, although some of you joined for the Siyum that we had 2 weeks ago. In any case, today we will be looking at Parshat Bo. And Parshat Bo contains some pretty interesting and dramatic things, including plagues. But where I wanted to focus our attention today, and there has already been a question in the chat pertaining to it, so I'm hoping that it is maybe topical and intriguing to some of you, is the first mitzvah, or the first commandment that God shares with the Jewish people as a people. Right? It's not the first time that God speaks, and it's not the first time that God speaks to a person, but considered to be the first time that God addresses or offers a commandment, I should say, not addresses, but offers a commandment to the collective of the Jewish people, is in this week's Parsha, and it is the new moon, or how to mark, or when to mark, how to mark a new moon. And so our question for today is, why this? Why, of all things, did this particular commandment or statement kind of inaugurate the relationship between God and the Jewish people? Why ought this be the kind of grounding for the relationship going forward? What about it is interesting? What about it is elemental or foundational, as I said before? So we begin with the verse. Hold on, I'm going to just put this up. Okay, I'm going to start with the verses. Forgive me over here. Okay, so HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana. This month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. Okay, and so Rashi says on this verse, HaChodesh hazeh her'ehu livana b'chidusha. So implicit here is a very small, an insight into a small word you might not have noticed. I probably would not have either, that Rashi is interested in, or the Midrash, which is hazeh, this. And the implicit question is, what is this? What is God referring to or pointing to when God says this month? And Rashi says that at this moment, right, God showed Moses the moon, her'ehu livana b'chidusha, in its renewal. Now, something that is fascinating and that I want to hopefully return to over time in the course of the next hour is this really interesting phenomenon. It's not a Jewish phenomenon; it's just a lunar phenomenon, which is that the new moon is really the absence of moon, right? And if somebody knows this better than I, please do speak up and share. I'm definitely no expert on lunar phases, right? But HaChodesh hazeh, or the new moon, or the new month, right, begins when there is actually no moon. And it's very interesting, actually. This is a bit of an aside, but right, the new moon, as it will come to be established over time in the Jewish community, right, will rely on human beings to actually see something and report it to the courts. And when there are two corroborating witnesses, then the new moon is established and the new month is established. It's done through fires, right? There's a fire that would be lit on one mountaintop, and there'd be like a chain or a kind of telephone game almost of one fire. The next person who would see the fire would light a fire, and so on and so forth, until the message of the moon would travel from Jerusalem outward towards those who are living right in farther reaches. A lot to be said there. But what is so fascinating, I think, right, is to ask the question of what are they testifying to? Right? If a new moon is a no moon, what is it that they're actually testifying to? Are they testifying to an empty sky? It seems here, and the Mishnah later will establish this, right? That there is what the witnesses are to testify to is the tiniest little sliver in the sky. In a sense, it's a retroactive statement that the new month has just begun, right? They're not testifying to nothingness. They're testifying to just this tiny little sliver. And this claim here is that that's what God is doing. That is what God is modeling to Moses, saying, this is the new moon. And now I'm in the English here in the Rashi. Right, so the Holy One showed him the moon in the first stage of its renewal, the chidusha, and God said to him, the time when the moon renews itself thus shall be unto you the beginning of the month. Or in Hebrew, kishehayareach mit chadesh yeh lecha rosh chodesh. So for those of you who have an ear for the Hebrew, you should hopefully hear mit chadesh is word for renewal, and chodesh is the word for month. So chidush chodesh, right, in the word for month is the word for renewal. Okay, and so this relationship between the moon's renewal and time's renewal and ultimately human renewal, right, is kind of implicit in the language itself and in the derivation of it from this moon cycle that is always in perpetual process, that is always growing and shrinking, growing and shrinking, growing and shrinking. And the moment of chidush, the moment of newness, remember, is this moment of nothingness, or said differently, is the moment of pure potential. Right? When there is no moon, it means the moon is about to start growing, is about to start expanding. Right? So to see no moon, or to see just that sliver, is to see the very, very beginning of a process of expansion. Okay. So with that in mind, this relationship between Chodesh and Chidush is what the Sfat Emet is interested in this week. So now I'm going to take you back to the top. Hope it's not too dizzying here. Okay, so the very first line is interesting here. The Sfat Emet begins with the words, Bamidrash hachodesh hazeh lachem, that's referring to the pasuk we just read, hachodesh hazeh lachem, ein lachem chidush acher. The chule, it says, or ... etc. Finish the sentence. Ein lachem chidush acher. Now, here's just a little bit of a kind of an interesting discovery that I made in trying to figure out what the source was that he was quoting, Ein lachem chidush acher. Interestingly, this is itself an appropriation, meaning the midrash that he seems to be quoting, and by the way, he quotes this time and again, so it doesn't seem to me that it's just a mistake, but actually intentional. The midrash itself says, Ein lachem chodesh acher. There is no other month for you. But he quotes it as Ein lachem chidush acher. I put it in a little footnote here, so bear with me. Okay, so the original midrash here says, K'sheyatzu Yisrael miMitzrayim amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ein lachem chodesh acher gadol mizeh. Lepikach nikra rishon shne'amar rosh chodashim. Which means, right, that when the Israelites left Egypt, God said to them, you have no other month greater than this, and that's why it should be the first one. You don't have any months yet. This is your first. It's a very matter-of-fact statement. But you can see here that he either misquotes or creatively quotes or interpretively quotes this sentence. And you can see the only difference is whether there's a little yud, a little dot, essentially, between chodesh and chidush. So, okay, going back here, right? So he says, but understand the difference in meaning. Ein lachem chodesh acher is a matter-of-fact statement about months. Ein lachem chidush acher means there's no greater renewal than this. There is no greater renewal than this. And let's think, we'll find out now from the Sfat Emet what the this is. What is this great renewal? And ultimately, how does that relate back to this new calendar, this new rhythm of months? He says, Ki b'yetziat Mitzrayim na'asu b'nei Yisrael kibriya chadasha mamash. In Yetziat Mitzrayim, in the Exodus from Egypt, or on account of the Exodus of Egypt, the Israelites were created anew. Chadasha mamash, Bria chadasha mamash, excuse me, a new creation, a truly new creation. Ka'asher nivcharu lichiyot avdei Hashem yitbarach v'nitzchadshu nafshotehem kemo shekatuv chazal beger shenitzgayer kekatan shenolad. We've talked an awful lot about gerim in this class because the Sfat Emet is interested in gerim. Here, gerim is used to mean a convert, right, or one who opts into the Jewish path. And he quotes a statement of the rabbis that says that somebody who converts, somebody who opts in, is like a totally reborn soul. Kekatan nolad, kekatan shenolad, like a baby who's born, right? We get a fresh start. There's a way to get a totally fresh start. And he says about the Israelites as they left Egypt that they were like gerim, or they were like newborns, people who got to completely start anew, right? They were leaving behind this, right, treacherous slavery, leaving behind a mindset of oppression, leaving behind a story of generational abuse, essentially, right? This is the generation of the Exodus is a generation whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents had all been born into slavery. So the idea now of freedom, the idea of leaving, not the idea, but the actuality of leaving behind this deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched story, way of being, set of horizons and expectations, right, was a radical, radical, radical departure for these individuals. And so the Sfat Emet sees this as a process of chidush, a process of rejuvenation, so great that it is like that of one who, right, chooses an entirely new path in life. And he goes on to say, "V'lachen katuv anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hoseticha, v'lo asher beraticha, ki zeh hu ikar yoter mehabriya." This is a really profound statement. Okay. The Sfat Emet says that the transformation of the Jewish people, or the transformation of the human condition at this point, was so great, right? It was such a paradigm shift that it exceeded creation itself. In what sense did it exceed it? Bracket that for a moment. He says, because this transformation, this power of recreation was so great, it became the anchor of the Jewish people, and very specifically, it became the anchor of God's own self-representation to the Jewish people, as manifest in the first of the 10 commandments. Forgive the noise in the background. I hope it'll go away. I don't know if you can hear it or not. Right, the first of the 10 commandments, God introduces God's self to the Jewish people. Right, remember, when we say HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, this verse that we are talking about, right, God does not address the Jewish people as a whole. God tells Moses, and maybe Erin, I don't remember fully, right, to tell them this, right? So it's the first kind of command that they themselves are receiving, but they're receiving it not from God directly, but from from the intermediary voices of Moses and maybe Aaron too. But when God speaks to the Jewish people, God's own identification is not, I am the God who created the universe, right? The God of Breshit, right? We as readers are introduced to our story through creation. But we as people, or as not we, but the contemporaries of this story, right, entered it through the Exodus, which on one level is a very literal thing to say, right? That's just the story that they're in. But there's something conceptual going on here. God wants to kind of root God's self in the story of recreation to them rather than the story of creation, because it is the story of recreation. It says here, Kizahu ikar yoter mehabria. This is more important. This is more important to these people, but it's more important as a guiding principle. Not that one can create, and not that one can be created, but that one can recreate or be recreated, right? That there isn't a stagnant self and there isn't a stagnant world that poof came into being, right? But the crucial message for this generation, as the generation that would receive, again, God's own self-disclosure, right? The centrality of a notion of recreation is what ought to guide them into the future. This capacity for change, this capacity for difference, the possibility that even after hundreds of years of one way of being, in this case, slavery, things can still change and people can still change and the world can still change. That, he says, as he understands, right, this foundational moment of the Jewish people, that's the story that needs to be told. So just, I want to recapitulate a bit. Number one, why does God, or maybe why do the people need to hear as the first commandment or the first transmission from God to the Jewish people? Why is it about the Chodesh, or the month? The Sfat Emet says it's not about calendars per calendar, right? Or qua calendars, excuse me, but it's actually about this notion of chidush, that the month, the phases of the moon perform this larger idea of rejuvenation and recreation. And that is what the Jewish people needed to tap into first and foremost here, as, by the way, they're on the precipice of their exit. And later, once they've actually exited and they stand at Sinai, the first thing that they need to hear is the way in which their own lives testify to this crucial and difficult truth that people can change, that worlds can change, that history can change. He goes on, Ube'emet ze atzmo haratzon, שיהיה לבני ישראל זה החידוש יותר עיקר מחידוש הבריאה, right? That God it is God's will, or is God's desire, that people value this idea of chidush, of recreation, yoter michidush habriya, even more than, again, the initial creation. Right? God isn't interested so much in the story of what, let's say, God was capable of doing once, but the grounding myth, right, should be one of people's own ability to change and change again, or create and recreate and recreate. Kihu hatachlit, because this is the point, he says. Yesh lanu lilmod ki kach nitkayem b'bnei Yisrael she'amdu al har Sinai. So this we've already said, and this was true for those who stood at Sinai. V'lachen emar lahem asher hotzeticha. Right? This was the generation that heard the words I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, right? Not I'm the Lord of your God who created the world, but I'm the Lord your God who recreated you, or I'm the Lord your God who was the occasion for your recreation. It says, Ki galui v'yadua lefanav yitbarach, ki bazeh mitpa'alim yoter min habriya. Now, this is an interesting sentence that I think could be interpreted in more than one way. But he says it is well known, galui v'yadua, it is revealed and known before God that ki bazeh mitpa'alim yoter min habriya. Mitpa'alim means to activate. Mitpa'alim, where human beings are activated more through this doctrine, more through this understanding of recreation than they are through creation. Meaning the story of the cosmos may or may not be of interest to any of us. How we got here, I mean, sure, Big Bang, whatever, 7 days of creation, lots of things in between, right? Like that's a good story. That's a, important, I guess, debate. But what activates people in the world, he says? What actually animates our behavior? What motivates us? What actually keeps us going? Here he's making a claim, you may or may not agree, right? Is this kind of forward-looking doctrine, I'm saying, I don't know if that's the right word, but right, not just what happened a long time ago that set this whole thing into motion, but what is the force that continues to push us forward and push us forward and push us forward and change and rechange and shift and grow and evolve and all of that. He says this story of rejuvenation, that's the story that can provide again, that kind of activating force to help us actually keep moving, keep growing, let go of the one story that has a grip on us about what our lives are or who we need to be or who we've been, based on who we've been, but to actually embrace this possibility, right, of growth and expansion. Let me see. I'm going to skip down just a little bit. Maybe I'll skip down all the way and then I'll take off the screen for a moment. ולכן יש התחדשות לבני ישראל תמיד, וזה החודש הזה לכם. Okay. Those last 3 letters basically mean, and now I'm done. So let me bring this together. Stop the share for a moment. Okay. Oh, many of you, there are more faces than I saw before. Great. Okay. So again, the moment that we're in terms of the Exodus story is deep in the plagues, right? In this transition, essentially, the transition from enslavement to freedom. That's the moment that this statement, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, Rosh Chodashim, that's the moment that this is introduced, right? The people are in this liminal state, and perhaps they're wondering if they are capable themselves of transitioning, of becoming something, someone, going somewhere else. And so is introduced the notion of cyclical time. It's interesting. I keep saying that. I'm sorry. I guess I find a lot of things interesting, but right, the lunar cycle is a cycle. It's not a trajectory that moves in one direction. It's not a statement or a performance, rather, of unlimited growth. Right? It's actually limited growth. It's growth and then shrinkage, growth and shrinkage, growth and shrinkage. And I think that there's something very subtle there about this message to the Jewish people. And again, I'm assuming here, right, that the message, as does the Sfat Emet, right, that the message to the Jewish people is a message to all the Jewish people through time, right? And that is, right? Just when you're in this space of transition and you're not sure if you can move and you're not sure, are you going to grow or shrink, right? HaChodesh hazeh lachem, hachidush hazeh lachem. There is rejuvenation available for you. There is change available for you. And the subtlety, I think, of the imagery is the sort of honesty, I think, in the recognition that in inviting change and growth, we know that it won't be a continuously upward march, meaning it's not just big and bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better and better and better, right? But there's something like wave-like, right? Ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs, or right, the moon gets bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. And so it seems like the message to the Jewish people at this moment is, right, chidush is available to you. And it's going to be available to you now. And it's going to be available to you in a month from now, and a month from now, and a month from now, and a month from now. And in between that time, right, there'll continue to be movement up and down, or wide and narrow, right? Recognize that after what feels like a lifetime of paralysis, a lifetime of being mired in, right, a story of slavery, right? There is yet incremental growth that lies ahead. And so the opening message then to the Jewish people in this transitional moment, and then later affirmed at Sinai when they are kind of on the other side of this transitioning to another story, let's say, right? There they meet the God Asher Hotzeticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, the God who activates change, the God who makes space for expansion, also for retraction. That's the tzimtzum of God, right? But a God who, God's self ebbs and flows. There's lots of mystical language for that we don't get into, but right, God's self is an energy and a flow that takes on different qualities and characters. And similarly, the claim for the Jewish people is just that, is that your first message ought to be one of the power and possibility of recreation. It's also the awareness that recreation is itself not stagnant, and itself will not remain in place, but will be part of a process that, like God, will ebb and flow and grow and change. And hopefully, like Rosh Chodesh, will be celebrated precisely for its, again, kind of instability in the best sense, right? For the way in which it's not stuck or stationary, but actually constantly moving. So I think that this is it's a powerful image in general. We are also just celebrating Rosh Chodesh Shvat, right? The new month of Shvat, which is itself a month that's about kind of growth and possibility, precisely in a dormancy. What I mean by that is that in the month of Shvat, we celebrate, right, the New Year of the Trees, which makes no sense outside of the land of Israel, where, well, actually, I don't know what's going on in other hemispheres, but in this one, at least, right, it always comes. I always find that Tu B'Shvat is like the coldest day of the year, and it's like totally gray, and there's absolutely no shkedia porachatz, if that reference means anything to any of you, right? There are no like growing beautiful trees. However, if you are in Israel in February, it is still cold, but there actually are the tiny little shkedia blossoms. The almond tree blossoms really do begin then. And it's precisely, it is not a celebration of a full-grown flower. It's not about blossoming, but it's actually about this recognition that right, we're just coming out of dormancy, just like that sliver of the moon is, right? It's not about the fullness of the moon, but it's actually about what's possible. We're on the precipice of something, and can we recognize that? So this feels timely, both because of this time of year on the Jewish calendar, and also this time of year on the secular calendar, the Gregorian calendar, right? That we just celebrated a new year as well. And these markings in time are each offered, right, explicitly or implicitly, as opportunities for resets and opportunities for rejuvenation. And I'll just share, I didn't put it on the source sheet, but there's another Hasidic thinker who I teach in a different context called the Nesivos Shalom, and Netivot Shalom, Chaim Noach Bernevsky. In any case, though, he writes longer essays, in this case about Shabbat. And I just read a very beautiful teaching of his on Shabbat in a very similar vein, right? That, okay, Chodesh and Chidush share obviously that linguistic reference, but Shabbat too is understood by some Hasidic thinkers as well to be a kind of weekly Chidush. And there's even a suggestion that on Shabbat, the words in Breshit of after creation, or on the seventh day, God rested, Vayinafash, that contains the word nefesh, which means soul. And so he, along with others, teach that on the seventh day, God, in a certain sense, ensouled the world, or breathed life into the world, suggesting that every seventh day, there's an attempt, or an offering rather, to recreate or breathe life again into the world, into ourselves, and to have a real reset. So much so, says the Nesivos Shalom, that again, in terms of guiding myths, a suggestion that had God not done this Vayinafash on the seventh day, the world itself would have returned to tohu vavohu, or to chaos. And there's a suggestion there that every 7 days, God has to do that. We have to do that. Because without the resets, without the moments of rejuvenation, we actually fall into malaise, chaos, we get stuck. And so the idea that the introduction to the Jewish people of Jewish time, right, is first and foremost, is a primary spiritual teaching for how they and we might need to live. And it's the unit there is the month unit. And I'm also suggesting that we have different invitations, whether during the course of weeks or months or years, as the case may be, right, to be in touch with this deep, deep human need for a reset. The ways that our stories tell about the success, essentially, of individuals and groups that intentionally reset, and how God's self then tells God's own story in this way, in a certain sense, suggesting and performing for all of us that even the infinite one, right, has a finite amount of energy, and even the infinite one wants to be engaged in a dynamic process of resetting, regrowing, renewing, etc. Okay, so let me stop there, and let's open up for some conversations. I have not read the chat yet, so please feel free to raise whatever you want. Verbally would be great. Arnold, go ahead.
Thank you. Happy New Year. When I was reading your notes before the class, it sounded something was very familiar about it, and it just reminded me of Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, which has in it near the end, it says, "This nation under God shall have a new rebirth of freedom." And he's hearkening back to the Declaration, not to the Constitution. The Constitution is a creation of the country. He's hearkening back earlier. Beautiful. And saying we have a new rebirth. And so I know he was he was a Bible reader, and he understood it. The other thing is, I mean, he died in 1865. I know the Sfat Emet was the head of the Hasidim, his group, in the late 19th century. I wonder if he was influenced at all.
I would love to think so. I don't
Yeah.
imagine so. But look, we can speak of the Judeo-Christian, tradition. The idea of rebirth, being reborn, is something that it will be familiar to lots of people in different traditions, right? Particularly the Christian tradition. So it would definitely make sense to me that it would be part of an American tradition, and it's very much within our own kind of colloquial language that we use. I think it's always just special to see some of the roots of that in our own texts, and I don't doubt that Abraham Lincoln would have found it in a biblical text, though probably not in the writing of the Sfat Emet himself. Rabbi Rebecca, I haven't seen you in a while. Nice to see you again.
I know, it's so good to be able to come back. I was so struck at the word chidush out of the mouth or the pen of the Sfat Emet, because my understanding is that word has a particular resonance in halakha that is almost terrifying. That we might invent something, that we might renew something, that instead of looking back to the way our ancestors have done it, that we might have chas v'shalom, a chidush. So I was shocked at this reading, and I was wondering if you can comment on that.
Sure. So I think I know the tradition that you're invoking when you talk about a fear of chidush. Right, the Khatam Sofer was famous for saying ein chidush, right, tachat hashemesh, right. He turned chadash and chidush. He played with those words to say there is no renewal.
That's Kohelet. That's Ecclesiastes for folks who are not following along. Okay.
Thank you. Right. So, but his riff on Ecclesiastes, right, is ein chidush tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. Right, because God forbid anything should be new. It's all old. It's all part of the tradition. And yes, there is a kind of Lithuanian legal tradition that is afraid of chidush, but the Sfat Emet just lies on the other side of that, which isn't. I'm not commenting on his halachic philosophy because I don't even think I know what his halachic philosophy is per se, but his spiritual philosophy foregrounds all the time chidush, hitchadshut, right? It's like one of his favorite words. We've talked a bunch about chiyut here and maybe a little bit less about hitchadshut, but it's all of a piece. And so, yes, 100%, there are those who are afraid of chidush, and then there are those who revel in it spiritually. And he is one of those, right? He is a person who thinks yesh chadash, yesh chidush tachat hashemesh. So yeah, so thank you for raising that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay, Julie, Leib.
So when you're talking about that we're celebrating the new moon during this moment of really potential for growth, and or what we sort of celebrate when a new person is born, whether they're a new soul, whether it's a Gerim or whether it's a new child or whatever it is. And also the people literally on the brink of sort of moving into a new space. So I wonder if you could comment on, what is there to help activate that process of renewal in that moment of potential? Like, what is it? Is it celebration? Is it just noticing that? Is there, what is it that moves that forward? Or just whatever.
Okay, so this is a great question, and I'm sure there's like a lot of wisdom on this call precisely about that and what practices might actually enable it. And I don't have one particular answer, but I will say that it is extraordinary, right, to think that the very first, I know mitzvah means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, so I'm not saying that everybody's obliged to do this or that, but the idea that the first transmission commandment, right, between God and the Jewish people is pointing like this, notice it, right? Be in sync with the moon, right? That is, I think, the beginning of some kind of practice, right? Is noticing And again, that noticing of pure potential. So it's not an answer for how then do you like activate that. A lot of people probably have a lot of different Rosh Chodesh practices that they may even be able to share here on the chat. But just the idea of marking that time in and of itself, stopping to do so, I think is really crucial. This is just a small thing that comes to mind for me. Well, two things. Number one, I have a son who is very stuck in his ways he hates school. He just hates it. Poor guy. He's 10 years old and he's like decided school is not for him. Longer story. But January 2nd, I guess it was Monday, it's time to go back to school and he's having a fit. And I say, honey, it's a new year, right? New year, new beginning. And he, being a pretty smart 10-year-old, says to me, well, it's all arbitrary, mommy. It's just arbitrary. I mean, it's January 2nd isn't any different from like December 31st, right? It's all the same, right? It's all undifferentiated time. So why should I think any differently on this side of January than I did in December? I thought it's a pretty good question. And it's true that it's arbitrary. And it's also true that it's profound when one actually can lean into that possibility for change. I know I'm not saying this to you because you need the message that my son needs, but just that it was such an interesting moment to see what actually becomes possible when you can subscribe to these rhythms that may or may not be natural. What's interesting with the moon, the monthly cycle accords with something that we can point to, right? HaChodesh Hazeh, right? And the solar calendar also. Interestingly, right, the week, the 7-day unit, does not have an analog. Somebody can tell me if I'm wrong, please. I'd be very interested. But the week doesn't have an analog, like out there in real time or whatever, however you want to say that, right? That feels like a true, like radical introduction that is arbitrary in a certain way, right? According to halakha, to Jewish law, like if you're in a place and you lose track of time, like you just count every 7 days, like because it's something particular about Saturday, right? It's not about Saturday. It's about sevenness. It's about, we talked about that on Hanukkah too, but it's right. It's about the importance on a weekly basis of cutting it, of like saying that was then and now I'm starting anew. So sorry, that was just like a lot of things that are a long way of saying, I don't know what precisely the practice is, but the recognition itself and the stopping and the pausing and the noticing, I think is just itself a profound opportunity. Other questions? Okay, while you all think of that, I'm going to just add one other small thing to this. And that is that almost all big Jewish holidays take place on the 15th of the month. Pesach, right, is the 15th of Nisan. And there was somebody here who asked a question about something related, so you can bring it up again if you want. Right, Pesach is on the 15th and Sukkot is on the 15th. And right, those are like the biggie holidays take place at full moon, right? Right, where it's not in potentia, right? It's in actua. I don't know the right way of saying that is, right? It's the fullness of expression. And what's something that's really interesting, right, is that we nevertheless, right, make this point of marking potentia. We don't only celebrate holidays and mark time when it's big and realized and when we feel realized, but actually when it's not. And the interesting outlier to this is Rosh Hashanah, right? So forget, the arbitrariness of January 1st, though it might not be, but from my son's perspective, but right on the Jewish calendar, right, is rooted in a new moon, right? The new year starts at a new moon. It is known as, in the Torah, it's called Bakese Liyom Chagenu. Tik'u b'chodesh shofar bakese liyom chagenu. Blow the shofar on kese liyom chagenu. Hard to translate that. One translation, kesa kisui, is covering, right? You blow the shofar on the day of covering, the day of the new moon, the day when there is no moon, essentially, right? And we start our year off, right? Our year that hopefully will also celebrate fullness and realization and the blossoming, right, of those dormant seeds. But we begin without a moon in a place of kisui, because there's an impulse towards the realization of what hides in potential. And so the hope is that, right, that our years can start in that way, and that we get a chance every month to get in touch once again with that kind of energy. Okay. Any other questions? Hold on one second. I do have yeah, go ahead, Anne.
I was thinking about the connection between the new moon and one of the things that we call God Ein Sof. You know, the nothingness. It's the
beautiful, pure potential.
And also, I was thinking what a gift this reading is right now when we feel like we're stuck in such a narrow place. Mm-hmm. It's a very hopeful reading, which I really like. Yes,
I think it's hopeful. I do think it's hopeful. And I also think that there's like a really kind of, I don't know, poetic realism to it too, right? Yes, it's hopeful. Yes, we start in pure potential, right? But we also know that the moon is going to shrink again, and then it's going to get big, and then it's going to shrink, and then it's going to get big, and then it's going to shrink again, right? And so to be in a hopeful place doesn't require this kind of Pollyannish, like we're living in the full moon. No, we're not, right? But we know when there's no moon that it will come back. Mm-hmm. And even when we feel diminished, it'll come back again. So I do hope that it's a message for the moment.
Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt you. The other thing that it made me think of was other themes like angels going up and down the ladder, coming and going.
Cyclical, nice.
Yeah, and just lots of stories where people start over. So it's one of our big recurrent themes.
Yes, it is. And it is more ikar, more central, more important than the theme of creation itself. That's a pretty big statement. Thank you. Okay, Stephen Sondheim, go ahead.
Hi, I put this in the chat. I wonder if there's something about the actual forces on human beings of the moon as it goes through its phases. It does the tides, it does our endocrines. Has there been studies that shows something particular about the amount of force and the changes and the attitudes that we might have? And then but the opposite is perhaps we've just become enculturated to the mystery of why is it gone? Why does it come back? And perhaps we've adjusted our psychocosmology to that notion too. Okay.
That sounded very interesting. I think I didn't fully understand the last part about the psychocosmology, but it sounded fascinating. Can you just say that last part one more time?
Well, instead of just the forces on our bodies, particularly, I guess, women's bodies, I don't know for sure. Perhaps there's also something in the way human beings interpreted the heavens. I mean, human beings have been very freaked out by the solstice and the equinox. The story is that they thought it wasn't going to come back.
That's right. That's right.
But I wonder if there's some, let's call it psychocosmology. In other words, we made up or interpreted the phenomenon based on what we saw in the universe. But my real question is, has there been studies to show the effect on the human body, and what one time might be more creative or newness, and what one time might be more middle? I'm not sure. And anyway, I just wonder that.
I don't know the answer, but I'm fascinated by it. And yes, we do know for sure, right, that the moon has very direct effects on our environment and ourselves and our bodies. And so it makes sense that we ought to be attuned perhaps to it more than other forces, but I don't know. Thank you for that. Okay, Martha, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, interesting. Martha, you're still on mute.
Just in response to Stephen's comment, there's biorhythms. There's been all kinds of studies of biorhythms in the body, and different organs have different biorhythms. So that might be something. But what I was struck by when you were describing this renewal, I thought, well, wow, that's like the basic life force that you see when you look around in nature and you look at plants.
Yes.
Right now, I'm busy watching my amaryllis starting to open up. So
I just got one in the mail as a gift. Oh. Oh, you're on mute again. You're on mute again. I lost Martha. I'm sorry. I hope you can all hear me. But I did hear about the amaryllis, and I was excited about that. And yeah, I think if I understood you correctly, that the cycles in nature are something that we can see around us, and it's not only the moon, of course. But isn't it just wonderful to have one opportunity of many to notice cycles, to notice change, and to notice rebirth? Sure, right? We just talked about or I mentioned Chodesh Shvat, that Tu B'Shvat is the holiday that's coming up next, right? The 15th of Shvat, which does celebrate precisely this, right? Not only the renewal of the moon, but renewal of plants and trees, and looking forward, to what will yet come back. So we have all these different ways of inviting in this recognition, and here's just one, a consistent one. Okay, so Chavra, it's a little bit early, and I have to apologize to you that on account of COVID, my babysitter has COVID and she's not here, and my daughter is screeching in the background. She was supposed to be asleep, but she's not. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to actually go a little bit early today, just 8 minutes. I hope I haven't taken too much time away. I really sincerely apologize, but I wish everybody health and well-being and rejuvenation and renewal, and hope for what's possible yet. So thank you so much, everybody. Take care. Good to have you back.